There are moments in history when a society is confronted with a truth so disturbing that it instinctively turns away, not because it lacks intelligence, but because it lacks courage. The discussion around organized sexual violence, particularly when it intersects with immigration policy and multicultural ideology, is one of those moments. It is not merely about crime statistics, it is about moral clarity. It is about whether a civilization has the strength to protect its most vulnerable members, while still upholding compassion. When institutions, media, or political leaders hesitate to speak plainly about patterns of criminal behavior because they fear social backlash, something deeper is happening beneath the surface. What we are witnessing is not simply a policy failure, it is a psychological failure. Multiculturalism, in its ideal form, aims to celebrate diversity while maintaining a shared legal and moral framework. But when the desire to avoid appearing discriminatory becomes stronger than the desire to enforce universal standards of law, a dangerous imbalance emerges. Every stable society depends on trust. Trust that the law will be applied equally. Trust that leaders will prioritize safety over optics. And trust that victims will not be silenced for political convenience. When that trust erodes, resentment grows, not only among citizens but also among immigrant communities who follow the law and suffer reputational harm because leaders refuse to address problems honestly. The shadow side of multiculturalism appears when moral relativism replaces moral responsibility. Cultures may differ in customs, traditions, and values, but the prohibition against violence, especially against women, must remain absolute. If a society hesitates to defend that principle unequivocally, it risks signaling weakness. And weakness in social systems does not create harmony. It creates instability. The question, then, is not whether diversity is inherently good or bad. The question is whether a society can integrate newcomers into a shared moral order without sacrificing truth. Because if truth becomes negotiable, justice becomes fragile. And once justice becomes fragile, the most vulnerable always pay the price. When patterns of criminal behavior emerge within specific groups, the mature response is not collective blame, it is precise accountability. But what often happens instead is collective denial. Why? Because modern Western societies carry a deep historical awareness of past discrimination and colonialism. That awareness, while important, can evolve into something paralyzing, a fear of appearing prejudiced at any cost. This fear creates a psychological trap. Authorities begin to censor language, media outlets soften descriptions, and political leaders shift conversations away from uncomfortable data. The intention may be noble, to prevent racism, but the outcome can be catastrophic. When institutions appear to conceal facts, public trust collapses. And when trust collapses, extreme voices gain power. The irony is painful. By avoiding open discussion in the name of tolerance, leaders may actually fuel the very intolerance they fear. The solution is not scapegoating entire communities. It is clarity. It is stating firmly that criminal behavior is the responsibility of individuals, not ethnic groups, while also acknowledging cultural integration challenges where they exist. True multiculturalism requires mutual adaptation, and immigrants must understand and respect the legal and moral norms of their new home, and host societies must provide clear expectations. But expectations must be enforced consistently. If the rule of law bends under political pressure, it communicates that some lives are negotiable. And that is morally unacceptable. We must separate compassion from naivety. Compassion helps individuals in need. Naivety ignores structural risks. A mature society can hold two ideas at once. It can welcome diversity and demand accountability. It can reject racism and still confront criminal networks decisively. The danger lies not in diversity itself, but in the unwillingness to confront reality honestly. When truth is suppressed for fear of conflict, conflict does not disappear. It intensifies beneath the surface. And eventually, it erupts in ways far more destructive than an honest conversation ever would have been. Leadership is tested not in times of comfort, but in moments of moral tension. When organized criminal behavior intersects with cultural sensitivity, leaders face a difficult choice: protect their reputation or protect their citizens. One day, strong leadership does not demonize entire communities, but it also does not minimize crime to preserve political narratives. The foundation of any functioning society is the consistent application of law. Law is not an expression of cultural preference. It is the boundary that prevents chaos. When individuals enter a new country, they enter a legal covenant. That covenant guarantees rights, but it also demands responsibilities. Cultural background can explain behavior. It cannot excuse criminality. If leaders blur that distinction, they undermine the very principle of equality they claim to defend. Moreover, avoiding the issue does not protect immigrant communities. In fact, it isolates. Law-abiding members of those communities often become victims twice. First, from criminal elements within their group, and second, from public suspicion that grows when authorities appear evasive. Transparency protects everyone. It allows citizens to see that justice is applied without bias. It reassures immigrants that criminality will not define them. And it reinforces the message that the rule of law is supreme. The deeper philosophical question is this: can a society maintain both openness and order? History suggests that it can, but only if it prioritizes shared values over ideological slogans. Multiculturalism without integration becomes fragmentation. Integration without respect becomes assimilation. The balance requires courage. Courage to speak truthfully. Courage to enforce laws impartially. And courage to admit policy failures when they occur. Without that courage, social cohesion deteriorates. And when cohesion collapses, fear replaces trust. Once fear dominates public consciousness, rational discourse becomes nearly impossible. That is why leadership matters so profoundly in moments like these. If we are to move forward constructively, the conversation must shift from accusation to principle. The principle is simple: individual accountability, universal law, and transparent governance. No society thrives by suppressing facts, but neither does it thrive by weaponizing them. The challenge is to confront crime firmly without descending into collective blame. This requires institutions that are confident enough to tell the truth and citizens mature enough to hear it. Integration policy must be realistic, not ideological. It must acknowledge cultural differences while insisting on shared standards of behavior. It must provide education, economic opportunity, and clear consequences for violations. Multiculturalism can work, but only when it is rooted in a strong moral core. Without that core, diversity becomes division. With it, diversity can become strength. The protection of women and vulnerable individuals must remain non-negotiable. That principle transcends politics. It transcends culture. It defines civilization itself. The future depends not on denying problems, but on addressing them with clarity and fairness. When truth and justice align, unity becomes possible. When they diverge, fragmentation accelerates. The choice lies not in abandoning compassion, but in strengthening responsibility. A mature society does not panic, it does not scapegoat, and it does not censor reality. It confronts wrongdoing directly, applies the law equally, and reaffirms its core values without apology. That is the path forward. If this conversation made you uncomfortable, that means it matters. Because growth never happens in comfort. It happens when we confront the truths we would rather ignore. This channel exists for exactly that reason. Not to inflame, not to divide, but to think deeply about the moral foundations of our civilization. If you believe conversations like this should be handled with seriousness instead of slogans, then subscribe, because we are building a space where ideas are explored with courage, not fear. And in a world that increasingly avoids difficult discussions, courage might be the rarest virtue of all. Subscribe, join this community, and let's continue thinking honestly, responsibly, and without apology.